Hey internets, recently the Karmelo Anthony case has drawn to a close, with him, of course, not really surprisingly being found guilty. And I've noticed that a lot of the videos and takes about this case don't really do a good job on touching on how this happened, what exactly happened, but more importantly, why it happened and what it implies. Because the truth is that the fallout from this case has kind of definitively proven that racist projection and hypocrisy, as it turns out, has consequences. A lot of the collectivist narratives that academia has been pushing for the last 50 years or so is a narrative that has very deep rationalistic flaws. And as it turns out, being wrong has, again, consequences. And I don't just mean consequences for Karmelo Anthony to the tune of his 35-year sentence. I mean wide-ranging consequences for humanity that will likely take a very long time to heal if people keep being philosophically illiterate about it. Let's just start with a quick rundown of the case and the evidence for those of you who either haven't heard of this case, or if you need a quick refresher, or if you just haven't heard the latest evidence because there has been more information about this case that has recently come to light since the lifting of the gag order, since of course the case has now come to its conclusion. TLDR. Karmelo Anthony, 17 years old, stabbed Austin Metcalf, also 17 years old, during a high school track meet. Metcalf then unfortunately passed away at the hospital shortly after, and then Karmelo proceeded to claim that he was not guilty via self-defense. But the problem is the evidence didn't really show that to be true, as well as just philosophically it didn't make sense. I already did a larger video on this, and the problem is that even from the standpoint of natural law theory, which is significantly more lenient on what is considered quote-unquote self-defense than the actual laws we currently live under, well, even from a libertarian philosophy perspective, it wouldn't really be considered self-defense. Because what is considered a justified action in self-defense always has some reason and rationality behind it. For instance, you can't just have a automatic laser defense system defending your yard that just pops out and vaporizes your neighbor's children the microsecond they step on your lawn, because that would be an extremely unnecessary level of force in order to deal with an extremely low-level property rights violation. And so self-defense, from a philosophical standpoint, makes the most sense when you recognize that you should be meeting aggression with the least amount of violence necessary to end the aggression. And the evidence of the Karmelo Anthony case shows that he very much did not respond reasonably. In this case, witnesses showed that Anthony intentionally entered the rival team's tent, so he wasn't even in an area that he actually owned, and then he refused to leave, became belligerent, and was openly cursing and taunting everybody else inside the tent that was again not his tent, doing the typical provoking measures of dropping F-bombs, calling everybody else a pussy, etc., etc. And that's one of the big pieces of evidence that came to light from the eyewitness accounts that we are now aware of now that the case is concluded. It seems that Karmelo Anthony repeatedly threatened and challenged the people around him while reaching for his weapon. And this is very much not self-defense. You cannot go intentionally looking for a fight, challenging people around you, and then killing someone as soon as you provoke someone into an attack. Especially when the attack that he finally received from Metcalf was just a push and a shove. This is often in philosophy described as the problem of fighting words when it comes to self-defense. You cannot just go into a bar, for example, challenge everybody around you into a fight, and then as soon as someone tries to force you to leave, pull out a gun and shoot them. That is very much not reasonable self-defense. In fact, it's just not reasonable, period. That's the main thing that just further shows his guilt, like this little tidbit from Courthouse News Service. McKinney, Texas. Texas prosecutors rested their case Saturday in the murder trial of Karmelo Anthony after witnesses testified the black teenager cursed, provoked, and insulted students at a suburban track meet before stabbing an unarmed white teenager who shoved him. 4 teenage witnesses testified for the prosecution on the 6th day of the trial. Anthony, 19 of Frisco, has pleaded not guilty to first-degree murder in the April 2nd, 2025 killing of Austin Metcalf, 17, also of Frisco. That, again, is just not self-defense. That is not justified self-defense under the NAP, and it is certainly not justified self-defense in Texas law. And so this guilty verdict is really not surprising. Karmelo Anthony's goose was kinda cooked. There was no way he was walking from this. Well, sort of. There was really, from the start, only one possible out that Karmelo Anthony had, and that is the racial sympathy card, which is exactly what you mostly find when you start seeing people defending him. This idea of ethnic victimhood, that he somehow would not be charged with murder in this case if he was white and the victim of the murder was black. That the justice system is institutionally white supremacist, that this was a case of all-white jury, and thus they claim that the only thing Karmelo Anthony is guilty of being black. And the problem with this is that they don't actually have any kind of response to the evidence itself. None of them actually try to explain why Karmelo Anthony should be seen as innocent from any kind of philosophical or even just a basic legal standpoint. They don't actually provide any counter reason to the analysis of the evidence, which is very sad and very interesting because it reveals that their argument is essentially just projection. The truth, of course, is exactly the opposite of what they're saying. For one, the whole claim of an all-white jury wasn't actually true. There were Asians and Indians on the jury as well. There just wasn't any African Americans. And the reason that happened is not a racist reason, it's just they couldn't find any black people who showed that they could be impartial. And if the prosecutors and the lawyers can't find anybody and they can't agree on anybody who happens to share an ethnicity with the defendant, then well, this can just happen purely by chance. And again, it by itself doesn't actually prove anything. And when we look at studies in regards to this accusation, it again just further shows the projection element. So for example, from the UCL in England, there was a study that showed no evidence whatsoever that white juries convict non-white defendants at any higher rate than white defendants. In fact, they actually convict non-white defendants less. In fact, interestingly enough, the opposite was true. It's actually non-white jurors that have a significant bias against white defendants, while being significantly less likely to say that a non-white defendant is guilty. And this is apparently when controlling for evidence. And of course you can say, okay, well, that's the UK, and we're talking Texas here. But there's also been studies similar to this in the United States that show similar levels of ethnic bias. Not as stark as the one from the UK I just mentioned, but it's still there. TLDR, there really isn't that big of a bias against black defendants, if any at all. And so the unpleasant truth of the whole ethnic victimhood narrative in defense of Karmelo Anthony is that white people, on average, are actually pretty fair, whereas African Americans are significantly more likely, as a collective, to claim that a defendant is not guilty just entirely based on in-group preference. And so the truth, sadly and ironically, seems to be that yes, actually, Karmelo Anthony did get some unfair treatment for his ethnicity, but that unfair treatment was actually likely in his favor. And so here's what I think is going on here and what the whole situation implies. As I mentioned at the beginning of this video, we're talking about the consequences. And the consequences specifically is that the problem here for years is that our midwit-controlled intelligentsia has pushed the racism equals prejudice plus power narrative, and much of the black community seems to have taken this narrative to heart and interpreted it as a free pass for them to be extremely racially collectivist. And people are kind of noticing, people are kind of tired of it, because the idea that blacks can't be racist, when that's actually given to the masses, the interpretation of that, what they actually hear is that it's okay for them to be racially biased, but not okay for others. In other words, collective guilt for thee, but not for we, which is not a philosophically sound narrative. It does not make sense. The whole racism equals prejudice plus power has been, at this point, very extensively philosophically debunked. I've done a couple videos on this myself in the past. You cannot reify and treat these collective averages as concretely real things, and then project that racial, ethnic, collective guilt to all situations in all contexts. Yes, it is true that some black people were unfairly treated in the past. Nobody can deny that. But that doesn't mean that Karmelo Anthony is a victim of white supremacy. They almost act as if white supremacy is like some kind of concretely real magical thing that psychically forced Karmelo Anthony to do what he did, and therefore the evidence of the case doesn't matter. That, of course, isn't what they're actually stating in his defense, but that's effectively where their reasoning seems to point. And so what we're seeing here is this racism equals P plus P narrative suddenly start to bite itself in the foot. It's resulting in very unfortunate cases like these, where people like Karmelo Anthony think that they can just get away with this kind of antisocial behavior and then play the race card. It's becoming increasingly difficult for the cathedral to defend this kind of thinking and defend this kind of behavior. Because here's the most ridiculous truth about racism equals P plus P. Academics, the ones that are actually intelligent, have known for years that it doesn't actually make any sense. They're not stupid. Some of them are midwits, but some of them are actually genuinely intelligent people. And yet academia has been pushing this philosophical narrative anyways, pretty much just for the sake of equality. They thought that it would create a equality-based outcome that serves the needs of their ideological worship of the very concept of equality. And so many of them pushed this ideology knowing that it didn't actually make sense, knowing full well that it wasn't actually based on consistent sound reasoning. And I believe in 2026 we can now safely say that the results of this are just an absolute fiasco. You can ignore ignore objective truth, but you cannot ignore the consequences of being wrong about objective truth. There is a reality that is real. There is such a thing as objectively true, correct knowledge that actually makes sense. You cannot push bad philosophy onto the populace and to just expect that to work forever. And so congratulations, anti-racist thinkers, and I use the word thinkers very generously here. This murder, this death of a teenage boy, well, his blood is effectively on your hands. I think I've pointed this out before. An authoritarian regime can use propaganda to claim that 2 + 2 = 5, and they can use force to make people say that 2 + 2 = 5, and you can brainwash the next generation into even believing that 2 + 2 really does equal 5. But when the famine comes, 2 wheat + 2 wheat is gonna be 4 wheat. There's no getting around that. And so what really needs to happen now is that academia needs to quickly course correct. They need to get away from the idiotic narrative of P + P, get away from the idiotic narrative of pushing collective guilt for some groups but not for all groups. Really, you should just not be pushing collective guilt at all, so that we can finally put this stupidity behind us. And that's really all I have to say. Thanks for watching. Please like, share, comment, and subscribe. And if you like my content, you can support me on Ko-Fi, Subscribestar, buying some merch, or becoming a member of the channel. But for now, that is all. Thanks again. Till next time.